My name is Rachel Caldwell. I am 30 years old. I called my father from a bench outside the oncology ward at Blanchfield Army Community Hospital the day a military doctor told me I had stage 3 breast cancer. And my father told me he couldn't deal with it right now because my brother was planning his wedding. 6 months of chemotherapy, 36 sessions in the infusion center on a military post where I had spent 8 years of my life serving this country as a logistics officer in the United States Army, making sure soldiers had what they needed to survive, and not one single member of my family ever walked through that door. They were too busy picking centerpieces. Now, 2 years later, my father needs me. And my answer was exactly 4 words. Take a second to like and subscribe. Because the phone call I got from my father 2 years later, the one where he was crying for the first time in his entire life, is the reason I am telling you this story today. Let me take you back 2 years, to the day that split everything into before and after. I was a captain stationed at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, assigned to the 101st Sustainment Brigade, which is a way of saying I spent my days making sure thousands of soldiers had food, fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies exactly where they needed them, exactly when they needed them. And I was good at it, because I had been doing it since I was 22 years old, when I graduated from a state university on an ROTC scholarship I had earned myself because my father believed daughters didn't need expensive educations funded by their parents. My brother, 2 years younger than me, got a check from my father without a single question asked. A check large enough to cover 4 years at Ohio State with money left over for a car and an apartment, while I studied on a scholarship that required me to wake up at 5 in the morning for physical training and commit 6 years of my life to the United States Army in exchange for a degree my father could have paid for without noticing the difference in his account. That is the family I come from. My father, Kenneth Caldwell, was 60 years old, a retired regional claims director for State Farm Insurance back in Columbus, Ohio, and he had spent 35 years sitting behind a desk evaluating other people's losses, deciding what was worth covering and what could be written off as an acceptable cost. And I suppose that is exactly how he evaluated me the day I told him I was sick. My mother was a homemaker who coordinated the food drives at First Presbyterian Church every holiday season, the kind of woman who would pack a casserole for a neighbor she barely knew, but could not find the time to drive 5 hours south to sit with her own daughter during chemotherapy. And then there was my brother, who had just gotten engaged to a perfectly pleasant woman with a perfectly steady job as a dental hygienist in Columbus, and whose wedding had consumed my entire family the way a house fire consumes a room, leaving no air for anything else. That Wednesday started like any other. I was at my desk in the brigade headquarters reviewing supply requisitions for a field exercise, the kind of routine work that fills most of the hours of a military career, the hours between the moments that matter. And my phone buzzed with a number I did not recognize. Something made me answer. The nurse on the other end of the line asked me to come in the following morning at 0800 to discuss my biopsy results. And the way she said it, careful and measured and too kind, told me everything I needed to know before I walked through the door. I sat at that desk for the rest of the afternoon finishing my work, because that is what the Army teaches you. You finish the work in front of you, regardless of what is happening inside you. And I did not taste the food I ate that night, and I did not sleep more than an hour, and I spent most of the darkness staring at the ceiling of my quarters on post, thinking about the fact that they do not call you in early for good news. The oncologist did not waste time. Stage 3 breast cancer, aggressive, treatment starting immediately. I sat in that office, hearing words that belonged in someone else's life, Words that did not fit inside the body of a 30-year-old woman who could run 2 miles in under 15 minutes and had never been hospitalized for anything in her entire career. And when the doctor asked if there was someone who could drive me home, I did the thing that daughters do even when they know better, even when every year of evidence suggests they should know better. I called my father. My hands were shaking so badly, it took 3 attempts to tap his name. He picked up on the second ring. I told him. I said the words slowly and clearly, the way you deliver a briefing when the information matters and there is no room for misunderstanding. Dad, I have cancer. Stage 3. The doctor says I need to start chemotherapy immediately. I am scared. The silence that followed was 5 seconds long, and then 10, and then my father said the sentence that I have carried with me every day for 2 years. We can't deal with this right now. Your brother is planning his wedding. There's too much to do. You're a strong girl. You've always been independent. You'll figure it out. And then the line went dead, because my brother and his fiancée were coming over to finalize the venue deposit, and that was more important than his daughter's life. I sat on a bench in that hospital corridor for 45 minutes. I did not call back. I did not scream into the phone the way I wanted to. I just opened my phone, screenshot the call log, duration 2 minutes and 31 seconds, and saved it in a folder I titled Family. I did not know yet what that folder would become. I only knew I needed to remember the truth exactly as it happened, because I had spent my whole life watching my family rewrite things to suit themselves, and I was not going to let them rewrite this. That was the last time I called my father for 2 years. And I think most of us who grew up in families where one child was the son and the other was expected to stay quiet in the corner already know what that silence costs, because we have been keeping it ourselves for longer than we want to admit. The first day of chemotherapy, I drove myself to the infusion center on the 4th floor of Blanchfield Army Community Hospital. The room was arranged in a semicircle of reclining chairs, each one equipped with an IV stand and a small television on an adjustable arm, and it looked like someone had tried to make a sterile room feel comfortable without understanding what comfort actually requires, which is another person in the chair beside you. The nurse accessed my port and started the drip, and she looked at the empty chair next to mine and said what I already knew she was going to say. Most people bring someone with them. I looked around that room. Chair 3 had a woman whose husband held her hand the entire session, whispering things that made her smile even while poison entered her veins. Chair 5 had a teenager whose mother was reading aloud to him. Chair 9 had an elderly man whose daughter had brought homemade soup in a thermos. And Chair 7 had me. Just me. A captain in the United States Army who had spent 8 years making sure other people had what they needed, sitting alone in a room full of people who were loved enough to not be alone. I kept my mouth shut. I told myself my family was busy. I told myself they would come around once the wedding was over, once the centerpieces were chosen and the seating charts were finished and the cake was tasted and the invitations were mailed. I told myself a lot of things that year, and every single one of them was a lie I needed to believe in order to get through the next round of treatment without falling apart in a room full of strangers who had what I did not. I texted my mother that first day, "Starting chemo today. I'm scared." She replied 6 hours later, after I was already home on my bathroom floor with nausea I was not prepared for. "Hang in there, sweetie. Mom's at the florist with your brother's fiancé picking centerpieces. Peonies or roses? What do you think?" I stared at that message for a long time. Then I screenshot it and added it to the folder and typed back, "Roses are nice," because there was no point in saying anything real to a woman who had already decided that flower arrangements mattered more than her daughter's survival. I did not tell her I had pulled over twice on the drive home because my vision was blurring. I did not tell her I had spent an hour dry heaving on the tile floor. What was the point? And here is something my family never once thought to ask about. I had spent 8 years building a career in the Army. 8 years of early mornings and field exercises and deployments and promotion boards and the slow, steady accumulation of a life built on service and discipline. And now, a military oncologist had initiated a medical evaluation board to determine whether the Army would keep me or separate me. And if they separated me before I could reach the milestones I had worked toward, I would lose everything I had built. Not just my health, but my career, my identity, the only life I had ever chosen for myself, the one thing I had earned without anyone's help. My parents never asked about any of it. They never asked about the MEB. They never asked about my career. They never asked about anything at all, because they were busy deciding whether the napkins should match the bridesmaid dresses. I sat in that infusion chair with poison dripping into my arm, while every other patient in that room had someone holding their hand. And the only message I got from my mother that day was asking whether the centerpieces should be peonies or roses. If you've ever had to make a choice between asking for help and protecting what was left of your pride, tell me if you would have stayed quiet as long as I did. Like and subscribe. Because what I found out about my family's Christmas card that year is something I still cannot say without stopping. I met Colleen Marsh during my 3rd chemo session. She was a registered nurse who ran the cancer patient support program at the hospital. One of those programs that exists because someone wrote a grant about patient wellness outcomes, and I had ignored the flyers for 2 weeks until she sat down in the empty chair beside me and said something I was not expecting. "You're always alone." She had the kind of direct eye contact that made it difficult to offer the polite, dismissive answer I had been trained to give. I told her my family was busy with my brother's wedding, and something flickered in her eyes that I recognized as the kind of quiet anger that comes from understanding exactly what that sentence means. She told me the hospital kept visitor logs for every patient, every visit, a record of who came and who did not. And she said some people request copies later for their records, for their memories. I did not understand why she was telling me this. Not then. But 3 days later, I requested my first copy, and what I saw on that page, my name at the top and an empty column where visitors should have been listed, was the clearest document I had ever read in my life. I want to tell you about something that happened during a break between chemo cycles. One of those brief windows where the nausea fades, but the exhaustion has not fully set in, when I felt almost human enough to drive. I drove 5 hours north to Columbus because I wanted to sleep in my childhood bedroom, the room where I had grown up, the room where my ROTC commissioning certificate had hung on the wall next to my boot camp graduation photograph. The room that was supposed to be mine, no matter what happened in the world outside it. When I arrived, my mother was not home. The front door was unlocked the way it always was. I walked upstairs and opened the door to my room, and I stood there for a long time, because the room I grew up in no longer existed. My certificates were gone. My boot camp photograph was gone. The framed flag from my first deployment was gone. In their place was a corkboard labeled "The Big Day," covered in fabric swatches and seating charts, and my bed was buried under tool and wedding magazines, and the dresser where I had kept my things was now stacked with favor boxes and ribbon. My parents had turned my bedroom into a wedding planning room for my brother, and they had not told me, and they had not asked, and they had taken down every piece of evidence that I had ever lived in that house and replaced it with evidence of the only child they believed was worth celebrating. I stood in that doorway and I did not cry. I had learned by then that crying required energy I could not afford to spend. I drove 5 hours back to Fort Campbell, and I did not stop and I did not call anyone, and I added the memory to the folder inside my head. The one that matched the folder on my phone, the one that was getting heavier with every passing week. And then I asked my father for money. The medical bills had arrived, and even with TRICARE covering the bulk of treatment, the ancillary costs, the medications my plan considered non-formulary, the travel, the things that fall through the cracks of any system no matter how comprehensive, had added up to more than I could handle on a captain's salary. I texted my father and asked if I could borrow enough to cover what I owed, and I stared at that message for 20 minutes before I sent it, because asking for help from a man who had already told me to figure it out felt like reaching into a fire for something I already knew was ash. His response came 2 hours later. "Your mother and I just finished paying for your brother's wedding. We don't have extra right now. Have you looked into a personal loan? Your credit should be good enough. No, sorry. No, I wish we could help. No, I love you." I screenshot the conversation and I added it to the folder, and I applied for a personal loan with a 14% interest rate because there was no other choice, and I would be paying it off for years, but I would be alive to do it. At least, I hoped I would be. I think most women who have raised a family know what it feels like to give and give and give, and then one day look around and realize that nobody ever noticed, and nobody was ever going to say thank you, and the giving was never going to be enough to make them see you as someone worth protecting. My brother's wedding was scheduled for a Saturday in October. I was between chemo cycles, and I was not planning to go because I had not been asked to be in the wedding party. Not as a bridesmaid, not as a reader, not as anything, but I thought maybe I would show up, sit in the back row, see my family for the first time in months. And then my father called, one of his rare calls, and he told me that he and my mother had discussed it, and they believed it was best if I did not attend. "You understand," he said, the way he always said things that were not questions. "You look unwell. You've lost weight. Your hair. It's your brother's special day. We don't want anything to overshadow it." Anything, meaning me. Overshadow, meaning remind 150 guests that his daughter was dying while they drank champagne. I said I understood, and I did. I understood exactly what kind of family I had. The worst night came after round 4. My oncologist had warned me about the cumulative effects, each round harder than the last, but nothing prepares you for lying on your bathroom floor at 2 in the morning, shaking so hard your teeth chatter while your body tries to reject everything inside it. I lost my hair that night, not gradually the way it had been coming out strand by strand over weeks, but all at once. And I woke to a pillow covered in hair that had been mine since the day I was born. The hair my mother used to braid when I was small enough to sit on her kitchen counter while she hummed and worked her fingers through it without rushing. And I crawled to the bathroom, and I could not stop being sick, and I could not stop shaking, and at 2:47 in the morning, I called my mother. The phone rang 8 times. Voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. At 3:15, I texted the only person who had ever shown up, and Colleen arrived at my apartment 40 minutes later, still in scrubs from a late shift, and she did not say a single word. She just sat with me on the floor and held back what was left of my hair and stayed until the sun came up, because that is what people do when they love someone. My mother called back at 10:23 the next morning. "Sweetie, You called last night. I had my phone on silent. Your brother's fiance and I were at the spa. Post-wedding stress relief. You know how it is. What did you need? I looked at the bald patches on my head in the bathroom mirror, and I said nothing, Mom. It was nothing. And she said, "Oh, good. Well, call any time." And she hung up before I could respond. And I screenshot the call log, and I understood, finally and completely, what family meant in the language my parents spoke, which was a language where the word only applied when it was convenient and cost them nothing. That December, a Christmas card arrived at my apartment on post. My mother sent that card every year to over 200 people, church members and neighbors and cousins and old friends, and it was always a family photograph with a handwritten note inside. I opened the envelope, and the photograph on the front was from my brother's engagement party. My father in his good blazer, my mother in pearls, my brother and his fiancée glowing in the center. I was not in the photograph. I was not mentioned in the note inside. The return address label read, "The Caldwell family," as though I had never been part of it. I received that card while I was bald from chemotherapy, alone in an apartment on a military post in Kentucky, and the family I had served and loved and protected and tried to hold together had erased me from their story and mailed the proof to 200 people without a second thought. And then I saw the video. My brother's wife had posted a clip from the wedding reception, and in that clip, my father stood at the head of a banquet table holding a glass of champagne, and he looked into the camera with the kind of pride I had spent my entire life trying to earn. And he said the words that I have carried like a stone in my chest ever since. Today, our family is complete. I watched that video from my apartment at Fort Campbell, 3 days after my 4th round of chemotherapy, bald and nauseous and alone, and the man who had told his daughter he couldn't deal with her cancer stood in front of 150 guests and declared his family complete without me in the room. I did not cry. I had run out of that particular resource months ago. I just screenshot the video, added it to the folder, and closed the app and did not open it again for 6 months. Because some things you do not need to see twice. My father stood in front of 150 guests at my brother's wedding, raised his glass, and said the words, "Our family is complete," while I sat alone in my apartment on post with no hair and a body full of poison, watching the video on a phone that nobody in that room had bothered to call. If this sounds like someone you know, tell me, because I have carried this for 2 years and I need to know I am not the only one. Like and subscribe, because the night I lost my hair is the night I called my mother and she didn't answer. And what she told me the next morning is something no daughter should ever have to hear. 2 years later, I was cancer-free. The day my oncologist told me there was no evidence of disease, I walked out of her office and sat in my car in the hospital parking lot and cried for an hour. Not sad tears and not exactly happy tears, just release. 2 years of holding every breath and finally being allowed to exhale. A lot had changed. I had been promoted to major. My battalion commander, Colonel Thomas Briggs, had kept my position available during treatment, had allowed me to work in a limited capacity when I could manage it, had never once made me feel like I was a burden to the unit, and when I thanked him, he said simply that talent and loyalty are worth waiting for. Which was the first time in my life a man in authority had said something like that to me and meant it. The Medical Evaluation Board had reviewed my case and retained me on active duty, which meant my career was intact and the years I had built were not lost. And I cannot describe what it felt like to receive that news, except to say It was like being told that the house you thought had burned down was still standing. I had bought a small house in Clarksville, Tennessee, the town just outside the post gates. Nothing extravagant, but it had a front porch with a rocking chair and a kitchen where I had learned to actually cook during chemotherapy when I needed to control exactly what went into my body. I bought myself a navy cashmere scarf to mark 1 year of remission, the most expensive thing I had ever owned that wasn't a medical bill. And I hung it by the door where I could see it every morning as a reminder of everything I had survived without anyone's help. Colleen and I were closer than ever. We had dinner every Thursday, and she had become less like a friend and more like the sister I had always wanted. The kind of person who shows up at 3 in the morning and sits on your floor without being asked and never mentions it again unless you bring it up first. My family I had not seen in 2 years. We exchanged the bare minimum: a text on New Year's, a birthday emoji, nothing that required anyone to be honest. I had made a fragile kind of peace with it, or at least I had stopped expecting anything different, which is not the same thing as peace, but it is close enough to let you sleep through the night. And then my father called. It was a Thursday evening. I was in my kitchen making salmon with roasted vegetables, the kind of simple meal I had learned to love during the years when eating was a negotiation between my body and the poison inside it. And my phone lit up with a name I had not seen in 2 years. I stared at it. The salmon sizzled in the pan. My first instinct was to let it go to voicemail, the way I had learned to let a lot of things go. But something made me answer. Curiosity, maybe, or the part of me that still wanted to believe in something I knew was not there. His voice was different, thin, uncertain, frayed at the edges. My father had never sounded uncertain in his entire life. He told me he had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, early stage, but progressing. He told me there was a dinner on Sunday at the house, the whole family, and he wanted me there to discuss the future. He said he needed his family around him. He did not ask how I was. He did not ask if I had survived. He did not say he was sorry. He said, "I need," because that is the only language my father has ever spoken fluently when it comes to me. After I hung up, I realized that in the first real conversation we had had in 2 years, he never once asked whether his daughter was still alive. I spent the next 2 days looking up Parkinson's disease, because that is what I do now. I research, I prepare. I do not walk into rooms without knowing what is waiting for me. Early-stage Parkinson's is a slow decline, tremors, stiffness, eventually difficulty with the things most people take for granted: walking, talking, swallowing, and it requires long-term care, it requires patience, it requires someone willing to put their own life on hold, and suddenly I understood exactly why my father had called. Not because he missed me, not because he regretted what he had done, because he needed something, and I was the logical choice, the daughter without a husband, the daughter without children, the daughter who had always been expected to sacrifice without being asked whether she was willing. Anyone who has watched a parent get older knows how quickly the people around them start making decisions as if that parent's comfort is the only thing that matters, and the person being asked to provide it is not a person at all, but a tool to be used and put away. Sunday arrived. I dressed carefully, not to impress, but to remind myself who I had become. Black slacks, a cream silk blouse, the cashmere scarf over my shoulders. I looked like a woman who had built a life without permission and without help, and I wanted every person in that dining room to see it. The house in Columbus was exactly as I remembered, a white colonial with a manicured lawn and warm light spilling from the windows, the house I had grown up in but never felt I belonged to. I sat in my car for 5 minutes watching figures move inside. My mother probably setting the table with the good china and the crystal, and all the props of a family that looked perfect from the outside. And then I walked up the brick pathway and rang the bell. My mother pulled me into a hug before I could react. She smelled like the same perfume she had worn to my brother's wedding, to every important moment that had not included me. The dining room had not changed. My brother stood from his seat, the golden child, approaching me with arms spread wide, and behind him his wife remained seated with one hand on her belly, 5 months pregnant, the next generation of favoritism already on the way. And then I saw my father. He sat at the head of the table where he had always sat, but he looked smaller and older, and his left hand trembled against the white tablecloth, a tremor he was trying to hide the way he had always tried to hide anything that made him look less than what he believed himself to be. And his eyes, when they met mine, held something I had never seen in 60 years of that man's face, which was fear. We ate in near silence. When the plates were cleared, my father stood, or tried to, his legs resisting him as he gripped the table for support, and he said what I already knew he was going to say. He said he needed long-term assistance. He said the family had discussed it. He said the word that hit me like a hand across the face. Camille, you're the obvious choice. Not best, not preferred, obvious. The leftover child. The one without a family of her own, as he put it, as though the life I had built from nothing while they ignored my cancer was not a real life, because it did not include a husband or a baby. He said I should move back home. He said it was time I contributed to this family. Contributed, as if 8 years of military service and 6 months of fighting cancer alone, while they celebrated someone else, was not contribution enough. My brother nodded without meeting my eyes and said it made sense, because he had the baby coming and the job, and he couldn't be in 2 places at once. As if I had not spent 2 years being in no place at all, as far as my family was concerned. My mother said the word responsibility in her soft, careful voice, the one she used when she wanted something but was too proper to demand it outright. Before I answer, I said, and my voice was steady because I had spent 2 years learning how to stay calm when everything inside me was screaming, I want to ask you something, Dad. When was the last time you asked how I was doing? When was the last time you asked if I was even still alive? The silence that followed was the kind that changes the temperature of a room. My mother's smile froze. My brother became very interested in his water glass. My father's mouth opened and then closed again, and for the first time in my life, I saw the man who had spent 60 years never being questioned find himself without an answer. You say I have a responsibility to this family, I continued. But when I was sick, really sick, fighting for my life sick, where was this family? Dad, do you even know if I'm still in remission? Do you know what my last scan showed? Do you know anything about my health at all? He did not answer. He could not answer because he did not know. He had never asked. I reached into my purse slowly and deliberately, and I pulled out my phone and I placed it face up on the mahogany table with the screen open to the folder I had kept for 2 years. The folder containing every screenshot, every call log, every piece of evidence of the worst time in my life. I told them I was cancer-free, 2 years in remission, and I watched my father's face as he realized he had not known whether his daughter had survived. And I watched my mother begin to cry the silent tears she always cried when she wanted to look fragile. And I watched my brother's face turn a color I had never seen before. I showed them the text where my father told me to get a personal loan because they had just spent $80,000 on a wedding. I showed them the call log from the night I lost my hair when my mother's phone went to voicemail 3 times because she was at the spa. I showed them my hospital visitor records, 36 entries, 36 chemotherapy sessions, and one column that repeated the same word over and over. None. 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 My mother reached for the phone with trembling hands and scrolled through months of entries and whispered, "I don't understand. Why didn't you tell us how serious it was?" And I said, "I did tell you," and I pulled up the screenshot where I texted her my chemo schedule, and she replied asking about roses versus peonies. I pulled up the 23 unanswered phone calls. I pulled up every single receipt of a family that had chosen a party over a person and then tried to pretend it never happened. My father sat very still. His trembling hand was pressed flat against the table as if he were trying to steady himself against something heavier than Parkinson's. He said the words I knew he would say. "This is the past. What's done is done. What matters now is the present. I'm sick and I need help, and we need to move forward." He waved his trembling hand as though my cancer were a scheduling conflict that had expired and no longer required discussion. My brother's wife cleared her throat for the first time in 20 minutes and looked at my father and asked whether he had known about any of this, the hospital visits, the money I asked for, and my brother answered for him in a voice I had never heard before, quiet and horrified. He knew. "Dad, you knew." I stood in my parents' dining room with my phone face up on the mahogany table, the screen showing 36 hospital visits and an empty column where my family's names should have been. And my father looked at that phone and then looked at me and said it was in the past and we needed to move forward. If you've ever had to decide between keeping the peace and telling the truth, let me know if your family has ever had a moment like this one. Like and subscribe. Because the 4 words I said next are the same 4 words he said to me the day I was diagnosed, and I have waited 2 years to say them back. I stood up slowly from that table, and I looked at each of them, and I said what I had come to say. Let me tell you what family means. Family means showing up. Family means answering the phone at 2 in the morning when someone you love is sick and terrified. Family means offering to help with medical bills instead of throwing $80,000 at a party. Family means, at a minimum, visiting your daughter in the hospital once, just once, in 6 months. And you did none of it. My father tried to say my name, and I stopped him with a single word. No, you don't get to say my name like that anymore. I am not your backup plan. I am not the daughter you call when you need something and forget when you don't. You have a son you spent $80,000 on without him asking, a son who has never been asked to sacrifice a single thing in his entire life. Ask him. My brother's head snapped up and he said he couldn't. He had responsibilities. And I let the silence after that word do the work, because he had just said the same thing to me that I could have said to them 2 years ago, and nobody would have listened then either. I started toward the door. Behind me, I heard my father's voice break in a way I had never heard before. Not when his mother died, not once in 30 years of my life. And he said, "Please." He said he was sorry. He said he was scared of what was coming. And he was crying, tears running down his face, his trembling hand wiping at them without success. And for one moment, I felt the old pull, the need to be loved, the need to be enough. The little girl who had spent her whole life trying to earn something that should have been given freely. But that girl had grown up. She had survived cancer alone. She had rebuilt everything from nothing. She did not need his approval anymore. "Dad," I said, and my voice was steady and clear. 2 years ago, I called you crying. I told you I had cancer. I told you I was terrified. And you said to me, we can't deal with this right now. So here's my answer. I smiled, and it was not bitter and it was not angry, it was just peaceful. The kind of peace you earn by surviving the worst thing that can happen to you without the people who were supposed to be there. I can't deal with this right now. 4 words, his own words, returned to him exactly as he had given them to me. I turned and I walked out of that house, past the family photographs on the wall that stopped including me when I was 18, past the chandelier and the mahogany furniture and all the expensive decorations of a family that had looked perfect from the outside for as long as I could remember. Past my mother, who reached for my arm and then dropped her hand when I did not slow down. She called after me from the pathway, "We're your family. We love you." And I stopped at my car door and turned and I said gently, "Mom, family doesn't leave you alone when you're dying, and love isn't something you only offer when you need something in return." I got in my car and I pulled out of that driveway and I did not look back, not once. The cashmere scarf was soft against my neck. The road was clear, and for the first time in 30 years, I felt like I could breathe. 1 week later, my mother called. My brother had taken a leave of absence from work because my father's condition was progressing faster than anyone expected, and he needed daily assistance, meals, medication reminders, help getting dressed, and my father had refused to consider a facility. My brother was doing it because there was nobody else, and with his wife pregnant, they could not afford a full-time caregiver, and his supervisor was not happy about the leave, and there was talk that the promotion he had been expecting was no longer on the table. I listened without commenting. My mother said my brother's wife was stressed, that she had not signed up for this, that they were fighting constantly. She paused and said she's starting to understand why you left, and I let that sit for a moment, because the quiet woman who had watched everything from the sidelines was finally seeing what I had seen for years. I said I was sorry to hear it, and I meant it, not for my brother but for the situation, for the collision between the life they had planned and the life that was actually happening. My mother asked if I would come back to help, and I said no, and I said I hoped my brother would figure it out, and I hung up. 3 weeks later, my mother sent a text that was different from anything she had ever sent before. She said she owed me an apology, a real one, not an excuse. She said she should have protected me when I was sick. She should have stood up to my father. She should have been there, and she wasn't, and she had to live with that. She said she was not asking me to forgive her. She said she just needed me to know that she saw it now. She saw what they did, and she was sorry. I read that message 3 times because my mother had never taken individual responsibility for anything in her life. She existed in the passive voice, where things happened and situations developed and mistakes were made by no one in particular. And here she was, saying I should have and I wasn't and I'm sorry in her own name, without hiding behind my father or the wedding or the timing. I sat with it for 2 days. On the 3rd day, I wrote back. I appreciate you saying that. I'm not ready to talk yet, but I hear you. Her response came almost immediately. That's okay. Whenever you're ready, or never. Whatever you need. 4 words, completely different from the 4 words I had been given 2 years before. The letter arrived 2 weeks later, handwritten, shaky, the penmanship of a man whose hands no longer did what he told them to do. I carried it in my purse for 3 days before I opened it. On a Thursday evening, sitting alone in my living room in Clarksville with a glass of wine and my Monstera plant as witness. He wrote that he was not good at apologizing, that maybe it was pride the way my mother said, and then he wrote the sentence that mattered. I made a choice, your brother's happiness over your survival, and I will have to carry that for the rest of my life. He said he was not asking me to come back. He was not asking me to forgive him. He said he saw the daughter he pushed away, and he saw the woman she became without him, and that she was stronger than he had ever been. He signed it, "Your father, if you still allow me that title." I folded the letter and placed it in my drawer. I did not write back. But I did not throw it away either. I showed it to Colleen the next day, and she read it carefully and asked how I felt. And I said I was sad for him, for what he was losing, for what we could have had, but not guilty. I had spent 28 years feeling guilty for not being enough. And then I got cancer, and I learned that some people will never love you the way you need, no matter what you do. And that is not your failing, it is theirs. I was not going to rush forgiveness. Maybe I would get there someday, maybe I would not, but I was not going to force it because he was sick or because it would make things easier for everyone else. I was not going to set myself on fire to keep someone warm who had watched me burn without lifting a hand. That was my boundary, and I was allowed to have it. 6 months later, I was still cancer-free, and my oncologist had used the word thriving at my last checkup. I had been promoted again and was running logistics for an entire brigade, a responsibility that would have been unimaginable to the girl who had once been told that daughters did not need expensive educations. I was seeing someone, a county librarian from Clarksville, with kind eyes and a terrible sense of humor, who knew about my cancer and my family and all the ways I had been broken and rebuilt, and who did not try to fix me, but just showed up consistently, the way people who love you are supposed to. Colleen and I still had dinner every Thursday. We were building a life, all of us, the family we chose, the one that earned the name by showing up. My mother texted me every few weeks, short messages, "Thinking of you, hope you're well." I responded sometimes, not always. We were not close, and maybe we never would be, but we were something, a work in progress, and that was more than I had expected, and exactly what I was willing to give. My brother visited my father twice a week now. Duty, I assumed, not love, but maybe that is all some families have when the love was never distributed equally to begin with. My father's Parkinson's had progressed, and he had finally agreed to a part-time caregiver, paid out of the retirement savings he had been protecting so carefully. The money, he had told me, did not exist when I needed it for chemotherapy. I had not seen any of them since that dinner. I was not sure I ever would again, and I was okay with that. My father lost his ability to manage his own finances within the year. He lost the steadiness in his hands that had once signed checks for my brother's wedding without hesitation. He lost the authority in his voice that had once told me to figure it out on my own. He lost the house, eventually, the white colonial with the black shutters, because the cost of care exceeded what he had planned for, and my brother, who had never been asked to sacrifice anything, found himself making decisions about his father's future that required the kind of patience and endurance and willingness to show up that nobody in my family had ever asked of him before, because they had always assumed that job would fall to me. My career was intact. My health was intact. My home in Clarksville was mine, paid for with money I had earned through 8 years of service and 6 months of survival and 2 years of rebuilding, and nobody could take it from me, because nobody had given it to me. I had a front porch with a rocking chair, and a kitchen that smelled like whatever I decided to cook that evening, and a phone that no longer made my chest tighten when it rang, because the people who called me now were the people who had earned the right. The letter from my father sat in my drawer. The folder on my phone still existed, all those screenshots and visitor logs and evidence of the worst years of my life. And I did not look at it much anymore, but I kept it because the truth is the truth whether you look at it or not. And some things need to exist so that nobody can ever tell you it didn't happen. I have my coffee on the front porch every morning now in Clarksville, in a rocking chair I picked out myself, and the only sounds I hear are the ones I choose to let in. The birds in the trees along the fence line, the neighbor's dog, the quiet of a life that belongs to me completely. And I am not waiting for anyone to call, and I am not afraid of what the phone might say, and I am not trying to earn anything from anyone who has already shown me what I am worth to them. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And like and subscribe, because there is always someone out there right now, sitting in a quiet house, holding a phone that nobody calls, carrying something painful they have never said out loud. And maybe hearing this story is what finally helps them understand that the silence they kept for years was never their fault.